My name's Oliver Mundy, and I used to work for the General Pharmaceutical Council, which is the statutory regulator of pharmacy professionals in the UK, and I worked in their fitness to practice department, so I investigated pharmacy professionals' fitness to practice, and in doing so I spoke to a number of pharmacy professionals, so that would be pharmacists and pharmacy technicians, who were going through the fitness to practice process, and I learnt that they were often confused and stressed by what is a very complex process. So when I left the GPHC in 2014, I started FTP Support, which is a company designed to provide healthcare professionals, so not just pharmacists, healthcare professionals with fitness to practice advice and support. And I'm speaking to those individuals that although some people do have cover in this area, there are a significant number of people that don't have cover, although you might think that they do, but actually they find out that that cover doesn't cover everything that they might need. So this is what we're going to look at today. So I've got the challenging task of making fitness to practice entertaining and engaging on a Wednesday evening. So I'm going to go through who we are at FTP Support. I'm going to talk about the healthcare regulators to give you an idea of what healthcare regulation looks like in the UK. I'm going to go through what fitness to practice is, and we're going to look at some definitions, but hopefully that will set the scene as to what it is that we're going to be talking about, because the main theme that I wanted to get across in this presentation was that there's been an increase in fitness to practice investigations, and we're going to ask the question of why that is, which is a dangerous question to ask perhaps because it's not easy to answer, so and perhaps there's not one answer as well. So something else we're going to discuss is the Francis report and the regulators' response to that report, and I'm also going to go on to talk about the standards, primarily of the Health and Care Professions Council. As I understand, most people viewing this webinar will be interested in the HCPC side of things, and I'm going to provide you guys with some examples of fitness to practice issues as well before ending the presentation on our FTP Support membership scheme. So FTP Support provides healthcare professionals with fitness to practice advice and representation. We've got a team of expert consultants. We also have a number of lawyers at our disposal as well. Our consultants, though, are investigators and decision makers with extensive experience of working within healthcare regulation, and we use those to help healthcare professionals that find themselves in the fitness to practice process, so end to end. So that might be helping with allegations that have been put to registrants, and they may need to respond in writing, but it might also be accompanying them to fitness to practice hearings as well. But we also work with organisations that employ healthcare professionals, providing training to improve their understanding of the fitness to practice process generally. And we often think that really with fitness to practice, prevention is better than cure, so we look to proactively help healthcare professionals avoid the pitfalls of falling into fitness to practice investigations. I always find it difficult to present to people on this topic because I'm not suggesting anybody that I'm speaking to is a poor healthcare professional or that they may find themselves under investigation. I try and sort of move people away from thinking like that, and get people to realise that good healthcare professionals can find themselves in the fitness to practice process or brushing up against it, mainly because of the great increase in cases, which we'll go on to speak about a bit later. So who are the healthcare regulators? So I wanted to give you guys an overview of who it is that is actually regulated in this sector. There's there'll be some that you've heard of and some perhaps that you haven't. There's the Nursing and Midwifery Council, which is the largest register in the world. There's the Health and Care Professions Council, which I've mentioned already. We've got the General Pharmaceutical Council, which I've also mentioned. And then there's the GMC, regulator for doctors. You've also got the Dental Council, Optical Council, Osteopathic Council, and Chiropractic Council, and you also have the Pharmaceutical Society of Northern Ireland, which work kind of hand in hand with the GPHC for pharmacists in Northern Ireland. Just to give you an appreciation really of the HCPC's challenging task of regulating so many professions, they actually regulate 16 professions. And that includes arts therapists, biomedical scientists, podiatrists, clinical scientists, dietitians, hearing aid dispensers, occupational therapists, paramedics, physiotherapists, radiographers, as well as social workers in England as well. So the reason for running through all those is to give you an appreciation of actually of the broad nature of the HCPC's remit, but also to give you an appreciation of how big healthcare regulation is in the UK. Those 9 regulators that I've set out there are responsible for regulating well over 1 million registrants. So it shows you how big a sector this is really. Okay, so what is fitness to practice? So we wanted to talk about definitions of what fitness to practice is. So it's a term that's bandied around quite a lot, but actually, what does it actually mean? So if you see here on this slide, this is from the HCPC's website, and they say that when we say that a registrant is fit to practice, we mean that they have the skills, knowledge and character to practice their profession safely and effectively. That also says, however, fitness to practice is not just about professional performance. It also includes acts by a registrant that may affect public protection or confidence in the profession, and includes matters not directly related to professional practice. So already there you can see that fitness to practice is not just about what you do at work, it's about what you do in your private life as well. And we will mention that a little bit more later as well. The NMC, by way of example as well, have a definition on their website, and they say that being fit to practice requires a nurse or midwife to have the knowledge, good health and good character to do their job effectively. And they say that they will investigate any allegation that is made against a nurse or midwife that does not meet their standards for skills, education and behaviour. There's another definition on the GPHC's website, and I'll get to the thought process behind providing these definitions to you in a second. It's not just a case of relying on what their definition is. So they define fitness to practice as a person's suitability to be on their register, and this means maintaining appropriate standards of proficiency, ensuring you are of good health and good character, and that you are adhering to principles of good practice set out in their standards, guidance and advice. The idea of providing those definitions to you is to just pull out some of the key themes that crop up over and over again when people talk about fitness to practice, and those themes are people having the right skills, the right knowledge, the right character. So there's this idea of integrity, there's this idea that being a healthcare professional is a privileged position within society, and you are therefore expected to adhere to certain standards. And there's also mention of, you will have noticed, mention of health as well, which can also be a fitness to practice issue. Okay, so as I said at the start, something that I wanted to discuss was the number of fitness to practice investigations that there are at the moment. There's been a big increase, and rather than just say that to you, I wanted to kind of display some of the stats that are pulled out in these regulators' annual reports, which they are duty bound to publish, and they always make for interesting reading. And you can see here that this is an excerpt from the Nursing and Midwifery Council, and you can see here that between 2012 and 2015 the number of fitness to practice investigations has gone from just over 4,000 to just over 5,000. So in a matter of 4 years, 3 or 4 years, there's been almost a 25% increase in fitness to practice investigations. So that means that as a nurse or a midwife, the chances of you being investigated have increased significantly. And something that I said earlier is why is that? And we'll go on to talk about perhaps why that is. So yes, so I was discussing the increase in cases from 2013 to 2015. So in 2 years, you can see there that the cases went from just over 4,000 to just over 5,000. So that being an increase of almost 25%, which is strange because the NMC's jurisdiction has not altered in any significant way. So the question really that begs is why is it that they are now investigating more nurses and midwives? Moving on to the HCPC's annual fitness to practice report from this year, that also shows an increase, albeit a smaller increase. That's an increase of nearly 5% in a year, and that figure actually accounts for an increase in number of registrants, because sometimes the HCPC kind of hides behind the fact that they have an increased number of registrants, and part of that is due to the fact that they now regulate the social workers in England, but actually that 4.8% figure accounts for that. So the increase in registrants does not explain an increase in cases. And moving on there to the General Pharmaceutical Council, this is perhaps the biggest change. This is an excerpt from their latest annual report, which when I worked at the GPHC, I had access obviously to their caseload numbers and had that access on an ongoing basis, but now obviously we rely upon the annual reports, which this one was published towards the end of last year, and they declared that they had investigated 1,597 cases, which was very shocking. And the next slide explains why that's shocking. Let's go back 3 years. They had stated in their annual report in 2012 that they'd received 777 complaints, but they make a differentiation between complaints and cases. So they say that all these complaints were reviewed and 254 were closed at their first stage because they were not within their jurisdiction to resolve. That leaves 523. So if you minus the 254 that they've closed from the 777, that means in 2012 they had 523 cases. So why is it in 3 years, going back a slide, but forward in time, that now in 2015 they had 1,597 cases. So it's an extraordinary increase in cases. So what we're seeing is a pattern. So these are just examples, but whether you're a nurse or a midwife or any of the professions regulated by the HCPC, so a paramedic or a therapist of some sort, or a pharmacist, why is it that actually now there is a significant increase in the likelihood of you coming under investigation? And to be honest, I don't think there's any one answer. I mentioned this at the start of the presentation. I think it's a dangerous question to perhaps ask because there isn't one answer, and we don't know the reasons behind it. But what we do believe at FTP Support is that the Francis report has played a big part in changing the landscape of healthcare and in particular healthcare regulation. So for those of you that don't know too much about the Francis report, let me give you a little bit of a summary of what it is. The Francis report was the result of a public inquiry into Mid Staffordshire NHS Foundation Trust. And this is a quote here from nhsemployers.org, and it says that following an extensive inquiry into failings at that trust, Robert Francis QC published his report over 3 years ago now, and it told a story of appalling suffering of many patients within a culture of secrecy and defensiveness. So many of you would have seen in the news, and I'm sure you're aware, that there were a number of stories in the press of patients suffering, and I think there's a few that stick out in my mind from what I heard. One in particular was about an elderly patient that ended up drinking from a vase of flowers because they were so desperate for water. The obvious questions from that were why has this happened, and how has it got to this, that these patients are suffering like this, and perhaps most importantly, why is it that these things weren't identified or weren't reported? Where were the complaints and concerns? Why weren't they referred to the bodies that we've already covered in this presentation? They already existed, so why weren't they notified of these issues? So one of the things that came from that report was the regulators' responses. So they decided that they would review the report and then give their response to it. So don't forget that these are statutory regulators. So they get their powers from Parliament, and they are therefore accountable to Parliament. And I think that given the nature of the report, they all felt compelled to respond. So some of them weren't even named in the report, and in fact most of them weren't, I don't think, but they all felt compelled to kind of respond to the report and give their views on what they would do as regulators to improve healthcare. So this is from the HCPC. So they had identified a number of areas of the report that was relevant to them, and they identified that they should look at how regulators and others can support a culture in which professionals and others are able to raise and escalate concerns they have about patient safety. So even there, from that point, there's a change or perhaps not so much a change, but perhaps an evolution in trying to encourage people to escalate concerns and make complaints. And that's certainly been reflected in the amount of cases that they've had. And there's also points here on handling fitness to practice concerns and sharing information, something that was mentioned in the report, and quality quality assurance of education and training, with particular emphasis on how standards and processes help to ensure the safety of the practice learning environment for service users. And I think, just discussing the report further, I think that it refocused minds within healthcare. I think maybe people working in healthcare became too driven by targets and balance sheets, and perhaps forgot about patient care. And these regulators' responses were to just sort of refocus people's minds and for people to think about what it is that healthcare is about. This was the GPHC's response to the report. There's quite a lot there, but they launched what they called was an ambitious program, and they identified 6 topics. Excuse me. Which included enabling the voice of patient and carers to be heard in pharmacy, improving their use of information, which mirrors what the HCPC said, making sure we can do all we can to promote openness and honesty with patients and families. And that became a bit of a buzzword, I think, after the report, you know, this idea of being open and honest. And then the next point of enabling people, including patients and people working within pharmacy, to raise concerns, again mirrors the HCPC's approach, and again shows that there's been a drive to get people to refer concerns to them. And then the final points there are continuing to use regulation to engender an open and accountable and just culture within pharmacy, and working proactively to identify and tackle issues of concern. And I'll talk about that a little bit more a little bit later, about this idea of being proactive or reactive. In fact, I could probably cover that now, because like we did with the fitness to practice definitions, you can see actually that these regulators, they very much mirror each other, and you know, it really does show that the fitness to practice principles do run through all of the professions, and you know, they've mentioned this thing about being open, being transparent, honest, accountable, and this idea of sharing information. The funny thing about their responses are they had standards in place for when these things occurred, so it's difficult to see what it is they're trying to do, because they've got minimum standards in place, and they always did have. So why is it they weren't met? So if those standards were enforced correctly around the time of the Mid-Staffordshire issues, they wouldn't have happened anyway. So that's why I wanted to talk about proactive regulation and reactive regulation, because the way that regulators regulate, they can kind of do one of two things. They can either be standards based, which they are, they have their standards that they state their registrants should comply with, or they can be risk based. And the problem with being standards based is that you are reactive in nature. You receive information that somebody has fallen below those standards, and then you act. So I was talking about the difference between risk-based regulation and standards-based regulation, and I was saying that the General Pharmaceutical Council actually does both, and that standards-based is reactive, whereas the way that they regulate their premises is proactive, because they proactively inspect those premises and they rate them, and the ones that are rated poorly, they then regulate those and focus their resources on those poorly rated pharmacies. And just a point that really most of the regulators, the way that they regulate individuals, it's reactive in nature, really. And I think some of these responses to the Francis report were an attempt to shift to a more proactive approach, really, to sort of try and get people to make those concerns, and perhaps they're reaping the consequences of that, and we've seen that you know, I've shown that earlier in this presentation with the stats that are involved. So yeah, it was just a little thought on that, really. I wanted to just go through some of the changes in the standards for the HCPC, because they've actually very recently published revised standards. And again, I think this is probably a reaction to the Francis report, amongst other things. And just as an overview of what the standards are, you know, I'd hope that healthcare professionals regulated by the HCPC were aware of these and understood them. It's always important, I think, for individuals to remind themselves and kind of come back to these and just yeah, remind themselves of the importance of them, really. So they are broad. I'll just go through them now. Promote and protect the interests of service users and carers, communicate appropriately and effectively, work within the limits of their knowledge and skills, delegate appropriately, respect confidentiality, manage risk, report concerns about safety, be open when things go wrong, be honest and trustworthy, and keep records of your work. I think these show the challenge that the HCPC face, really, because they regulate so many professions that it just shows you how broad these need to be able to cover every eventuality of every professional that they regulate. But perhaps it's worth noting, actually, that for each profession, so of the 16 professions that they regulate, they do actually have individual profession guidance, and if you guys want to take a look at that, they're on the website, and I would recommend that you take a look and just familiarize yourself with that. So in short, I wanted to go through sort of briefly what the changes to those standards were, because the obvious question for them introducing new standards is why, you know, what's changed. And you'll know that there's a standard now about reporting and escalating concerns, and this fits hand in hand with the Francis report stuff that we've been talking about, as does this second point of a standard about being open and honest when things go wrong. I've actually got a quote here from their standards regarding being open and honest, because, as I said, those became phrases that were used a lot after the Francis report: being open, being honest. It's very similar to the NMC's duty of candor, this idea of apologizing. So this is taken from the standards themselves, and it says individuals are expected to tell service users and carers when they become aware that something has gone wrong with the care, treatment, or other services that they provide, and to take action to put matters right wherever possible. They are also required to consider making an apology and to make sure that the service user receives an explanation of what happened. One of the questions we often get asked in that respect is, does an apology, is that an admission of liability or guilt or anything like that? Generally, the answer to that is no. And there's been a move really from the NHS on that, with the duty of candour, to promote apologies, and one of the ways it's done that is by saying that actually to apologise doesn't mean that you think you have done anything wrong. Okay, so those are the changes with standards. I just wanted to let you guys know that, as I said at the start, I thought that quite a few people viewing this webinar would be regulated by the HCPC, and clearly that is relevant. But one of the things you can see throughout healthcare regulation as a whole is that for each profession the standards are very similar. So something else that I wanted to talk about was moving completely on really from the increase in investigations and the Francis report. I wanted to talk about what you might have to declare, because there is an obligation on you as health and care professionals to declare certain things to your regulator, and then after this we can talk about what things might be investigated. So what exactly is it that falls within a regulator's jurisdiction, because some people can get quite confused, and to be fair, it's not particularly easy, and a lot of the queries we get from clients, they might have been on the website of the HCPC or another regulator, and they don't necessarily do a particularly good job of being clear. So what I've done here is go straight to the source for the HCPC, which is their Health and Social Work Professions Order. So this is a statute which says that fitness to practice can be impaired by reason of misconduct, a lack of competence, a conviction or caution, and we'll talk more about those in a second, or physical or mental health. And again, this thing that your fitness to practice can be impaired by reason of ill health, which is often forgotten. To be fair to the HCPC, although their website might be difficult to navigate around, they are very clear in their revised standards that were published a couple of months ago about what needs to be declared. So of all the regulators, actually, I think this is very, very clear and very good. And they say that you must tell them as soon as possible if you accept a caution from the police, or charged with or found guilty of a criminal offence. And that's slightly different from some of the other regulators. They say that you only have to declare a criminal offence if you are found guilty and convicted. But what the HCPC are saying here is that even if you are just charged by the police, which is obviously earlier in the process, you should tell them. And there's also some other information there about notifying them if another organisation has taken action or made a finding against you, and if you have had any restriction placed on your practice, you should also notify them. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about convictions and cautions was, and this does go back to what I said earlier, was it's a touchy subject really to suggest that anybody I'm speaking to has been convicted or cautioned or will be convicted or cautioned. But there is a high percentage of fitness to practice cases are convictions and cautions, and they are for, and I don't wish to downplay any conviction or caution. I know that they are serious criminal offences, but there are some that people kind of, I wouldn't say don't take seriously, but they don't. I think they don't realise the impact that they can have on their professional life. Because the reason I say that, I think most people would understand the fitness to practice implications of, let's say, an assault conviction on a patient, which is clearly very serious, but perhaps don't really understand that some convictions and cautions in your private life can have, or will have really, implications for your fitness to practice. So this slide was just to highlight a few convictions and cautions that you might want to have a think about. But actually, in reality, as I showed you on the previous slide, you should declare any conviction or caution anyway. So it doesn't really matter what it is. You should declare it to the regulator. But I've just picked out here things like drink driving convictions. High number of fitness to practice cases are these convictions. Convictions and cautions relating to private life. Also historic cautions and convictions, so things that are flagged up by CRB and DBS checks, things from the 70s or the 80s that can kind of be not necessarily forgotten about, but maybe swept under the carpet a little bit. These are the sorts of things that the big fitness to practice cases that have escalated that I've worked on have been things like this, and I'm going to explain why in just a second. I've also got the fourth bullet point there. I've put that the police dispose of cases with cautions whenever they can, because it's kind of a warning and it's seen to be in the public interest to do so. But and I've got to be careful because I've got no evidence of police advice, and I'm not suggesting that the police don't do a correct job, but I think that there can be a situation where something happens and somebody is cautioned. The police kind of say, well, accept this police caution, and if you sign this, you don't have to go to court. It doesn't appear on your criminal record. You don't need to declare it to anyone. That's not true. Just to repeat myself, any caution should be declared. Now, the reason I want to talk about convictions and cautions really was because, as I said, a lot of cases are based on this, and the reason why these cases begin to escalate is when you don't declare them, because the regulators say that if you don't declare these within a certain time frame, and it's normally something like 7 days, they say that that is a dishonest act. So a good example being drink driving, because they are common for the regulators. If you were convicted of a simple drink driving offence, you would probably receive a warning, but it wouldn't affect your ability to practice. You wouldn't lose your registration, basically. But if you didn't declare it, that would be a second allegation that you failed to declare, and therefore that makes you a dishonest person. And I think there's some discussion around how dishonest something like that is, because on your registration forms or renewal forms there'll be a question about have you been convicted or cautioned? If you tick no and you have been, they say that's dishonest, and they use this two-stage test. So R on gauche is actually a criminal law test, and it's a huge area really, but it's actually applicable for professional regulation. I think that case is called Twin Sectra, actually. So the two-stage test is that according to the ordinary standards of reasonable and honest people, was it dishonest conduct? So some people might think that actually ticking the wrong box on a form is not dishonest, but actually the regulators do view that as dishonest by the ordinary standards of reasonable and honest people. And the second stage, which you can only move on to once you've fulfilled the first stage, is did the accused realise that his or her conduct was dishonest by those standards. This is, as I said, this is a big legal area, and it's slightly heavy really for the purposes of this presentation, but I wanted to just get you thinking about dishonest acts and how they're viewed by the regulator, because they're viewed very seriously, and that is when cases such as drink driving, I was saying that would be a warning. You would be looking at perhaps being struck off if you didn't declare it, because you would be seen as a dishonest person, and therefore the sanction would be more severe. So I thought it would be helpful really, sort of moving towards the end of the presentation really, is just to not only what should be declared, but what can be investigated. What is it that regulators look at? And I wanted to give you an impression of how broad these investigations can be. So there can be anything from incorrect advice to patients. It could be, as we've mentioned, inaccurate declarations in terms of registration or renewal. It could be domestic incidents. It could be health matters. It could be inadequate supervision. It could be, I've put here, dishonest assertions on a CV. Some things like that, you think to yourself, well, can that really be a fitness to practice matter? Well, if exaggerating, as some people might do on a CV, and again, I'm not suggesting anybody would do this, but exaggerating can become lying. And if you, for example, I'd read an article recently on the BBC News website about people providing incorrect grades from their degrees on their CV. That sort of thing can come back and bite you, because if you're proven to have been dishonest, then that is something that can become a fitness to practice matter. Inappropriate comments on social media, which is obviously a big thing at the moment. If you go on onto our website, which I will give you in a minute, there's a article on there about a doctor doing this, and he was dealt with by the GMC. Poor working practices, so having not having the right standard operating procedures in place. Driving offences we've mentioned. behaviour regarding colleagues, whether that be anything to do with bullying, or perhaps it could be failing to maintain professional boundaries with those colleagues or even with patients, and financial matters as well, so anything to do with fraud or anything like that. These are all fitness to practice issues, and they're all things that regulators are looking at more and more, as I've shown you previously in terms of the increase in cases. So before I go, I just wanted to mention the launch of our product, which is the membership scheme, and this is something that we've created on the back of the increase in fitness to practice cases. So we've noticed that although some people do have fitness to practice cover, it doesn't cover everything. So it doesn't cover things like willful acts of fitness to practice issues. So, for example, drink driving or something like that, you wouldn't be covered. And the membership really, so if I just give you a breakdown of actually what it is for £5.99 a month or £65 a year. That means that if your fitness to practice does come under investigation, we provide you with full and comprehensive support, and that's advice and representation should you be investigated. So that would include corresponding to your regulator on your behalf, but it would also include providing you representation at any hearing that you find yourself in. We also provide members with up-to-date fitness to practice news. So as I've already shown you, the kind of landscape changes month by month really. So it's about keeping you updated, and it comes back to this thing of prevention being better than cure, so keep you fit to practice. And we also have a telephone hotline if you had any kind of emergency question that you wanted to ask, or you received something from your regulator and you wanted to speak to someone. There's more information on our website, so that is www.ftp-support.co.uk. That's also got a number of other things that you might want to take a look at. The membership comes under services for individuals, but we also have a tab for news and views as well, so there's some articles on there. The point being with the membership is that this is quite a serious subject. If you were to find yourself under investigation, we find that our clients are very stressed, and that it's a confusing and complex process, and it's something that's best left to the experts, I suppose, to help you with, and obviously we are that team of experts. In terms of the costs, I look at it as it's no different to having cover for your mobile phone or home insurance, and it just gives you that complete peace of mind regarding your fitness to practice, which, as I've mentioned, is a scary experience. And my final slide there is just information about our website. I've got my email address there if anybody's got any questions, and that's also our office number as well, should anybody want to contact us. And we're on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. I will pass back to Andrew, who might have some questions from some of the attendees. But before I do, firstly, apologies for the technical difficulties, because I think that was quite frustrating, although from what I could hear, it sounded like Andrew did a very good deputising job. Perhaps you can come and work for us at FTP Support, Andrew.
If I had any spare time, Oliver, I would.
But also, just before I hand over to Andrew for questions as well, just to reiterate what I said at the start, really, thank you very much for anybody who's listened, and also thank you to Andrew and CPD me for having me as well, because I really appreciate it, and I hope people have found it useful.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Oliver. Just a quick point. When I've looked at the cost for the insurance, as we discussed earlier when I was saying about my concerns of fitness to practice, the cost of your insurance is cheaper than my insurance for my iPhone. And when I put that into context of losing my phone and getting a replacement, and losing my job, which I've worked very hard to go to university and achieve what I've already achieved to date, it's a no-brainer really, because I wouldn't know where to start. I would sit with my head in my hands, perhaps do a Google search, and really not know who to turn to, and so I have to say it is extremely affordable, without a question of doubt. So,
and that was really the purpose really was to make it affordable, but also not impact on the quality of the support that you would get, and obviously the challenge is the vast majority, even though the investigations are going up, the vast majority of healthcare professionals are fit to do their job 100%. They're all brilliant. But it's just about getting that message across that you don't need to be a bad healthcare professional to find yourself in this process anymore, because of the huge remit of what they're looking into. So I just think it's a good idea just to have that peace of mind.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, the first question from Ian. Ian wants to know, how did the number of registrants change in the same period? I'm guessing it's relating to back when you talked about the slide and the number of cases that was increasing.
Thank you, Ian. If that's relating to the HCPC and the increase, I think there was just before the period we were talking about, so I think it was about 2013. I do know that there was a huge increase in registrants because of the social workers in England, but if it was after that, which I think that's perhaps what the question relates to, I don't know why that would be. That was only a slight increase as well, so it wasn't as if it was a huge increase. That can only be that there are just more registrants, so more and more healthcare registrants.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, Oliver. I think it's probably because most people in sort of less ranking roles, certainly from my perspective as a paramedic, I'm seeing lots of very good experienced ambulance technicians now stepping into the university arena and becoming a registered healthcare professional, qualifying as paramedics, and so there could be an increase of flow from people who have been existingly not registered health professionals stepping into the arena to become registered under these governing bodies, and so that could be one of the reasons for an increase. And when you cross that under the 16 professions of the HCPC, the numbers could probably dramatically increase over a short period of time. Good question, Ian. Next one is a question.
Sorry, Andrew. Just to add to that, because one of the things from the Francis report was the involvement of care assistants, and obviously they're not registered, and then there became an argument about care assistants being regulated. And it's a difficult, I think, regulation and the registering of healthcare professionals is obviously a good thing, because, as I said before, it's a privileged position and they should be held accountable if anything goes wrong. But you do often find, actually, sometimes to me, for a doctor to be registered makes sense, and sometimes it's linked to income, isn't it? That actually somebody who has a higher income can afford to pay for all the things that are associated with that kind of privileged position. But when you get somebody being a care assistant, which would be somebody who earns less, it all of a sudden seems slightly onerous for them to be registered, and almost seems a bit unfair, I suppose, and also perhaps means that people don't want to become those professions, care assistant or anything like that. So I think there's something about that as well.
Yeah, interesting. Question from Caden. Caden wants to know, is the increase in fitness to practice investigations occurring internationally?
Good question. I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to make a note of that. I don't know the best way to find out. So the only way to find out this kind of stuff, as I said before, was through annual reports. It would be difficult to find out internationally if that's the case, and it wouldn't surprise me if it does differ from country to country. But I'm going to take a look at that, actually, because that's an interesting point, and perhaps I can answer that question offline.
Yeah. We'll have Caden's email address that we can email her. Okay, next question from Martin is, are the increases across the board, or are more coming from one particular group, i.e. greater increase in percentage from members of the public in relation to fitness to practice questions, complaints?
I'm going to go back a few slides actually, because you'll see they might have already seen this. It's always the vast majority members of the public. I don't think in terms of increase there's anything in that. I think it's always been members of the public largely. But what I have found is, just from talking to people really, so it's not really evidence-based, people, for example, employers of healthcare professionals, I think are less likely to sit on matters now and deal with them themselves. I think they're more likely now to refer them on. And when I worked at the GPHC, we used to refer to things as the hot potato that people used to kind of pass along. And I think that's what's happened. I think it's always been a large proportion of members of the public, and I think that's maintained by people living now more in a complaints environment. But I think it also sits with employers and people within the healthcare sort of middle management positions, because they don't want to take responsibility for these things. Quite rightly, I think they pass them on to the regulator, because that's what the regulator is there to do.
Yeah, I probably agree with you. I think that's fairly pretty much what I hear in current practice is within the scope of practice of the employer. They'll simply just pass it on to the regulatory bodies. Good question. Next question is from Ian, and Ian wants to know, is work within the limit of their knowledge and skills seen as a limit or a target, i.e. do only what you are trained to do or do everything you are trained to do? Good question.
Another good question, and I can only really give my sort of view on that. Really, I read that as a limit. Really, it's about not. It's about understanding your limitations, I think, and not giving advice on things that you perhaps haven't looked into. I don't think it's about doing things that you should be trained on. That probably, to be fair, is covered elsewhere in the standards in terms of being proactive, in terms of putting the patient first and all that.
Yeah, I think in relation to practice, Ian, it's about do no harm and stay within your scope of practice. I do understand, being a frontline clinician, that sometimes you have to step outside guidelines, but just always be wary of that and you use intuition, reflection, and evidence based on whatever the decision you're going to make at the time. Don't put yourself at risk, and don't put yourself in an unnecessary situation where you're going to have your fitness to practice questioned by stepping outside the guideline. As far as I'm aware, I don't think they do, but you won't get badges in the ambulance service for the amount of merits for stepping outside guidelines. You're more likely to have a disciplinary or some kind of incident learning analysis than have a pat on the back as a well done. But good question. Next question is from Alan, and Alan has asked an apology. The definition: a regretful acknowledgement of an offence or failure. Surely a service user receiving an apology would see it this way: the registrant admitting a failure, should registrants seek advice first?
I would always suggest seeking advice first, and I think it's this whole duty of candour and issuing apologies. I think it's a really tricky area, because I think there is a potential for somebody to apologise with the intent of not accepting liability, but the person that hears the apology thinks that it is. So I think that's a real risk in terms of issuing that apology, and it's difficult because it's case by case, isn't it? And not only that, you will be bound by the policy of where you work and your individual regulator. I think it's too difficult to give a blanket rule to it. But that, to me, is where the real issue lies, is with the intent of the apology and how it's received. And I think sometimes that can happen. I think that somebody can say, "I'm sorry that this has happened, but it's not my fault," and the person hearing it thinks they've apologised and therefore they've admitted liability. So I think it's a difficult area.
Yeah, it is difficult. I've been involved in some incident learning analysis, Alan, when that's been pretty much I've sat behind the person who's defending themselves and said, do you know what, in a similar situation, I would have done the same thing, perhaps as a degree level paramedic. However, take away the degree, my common sense element would have made me do the same thing as that other paramedic did. And so sometimes they find it very hard to accept that they have to apologise even when they were in the right, just on the basis of this policy. And so, yeah, but good question. We see that quite a lot in practice. It's quite common. Next question from Richard is, are fines exempt from disclosure as they are not mentioned, for example, drunk and disorderly?
Can you repeat that?
Are fines exempt from disclosure as they are not mentioned, for example, being drunk and disorderly or being charged for being drunk and disorderly, I guess, in a public place?
Yeah, okay. So things like fixed penalty notices, as far as I know, I'm going to go through to the actual legislation here, does not fall under that. So no insurance is another good example actually on your vehicle, because normally you would go to court for that. That would be a reportable offence, and you'd go to court, and you would therefore be, I mean, obviously if you were guilty you'd be convicted, and you would have to declare it. But you can actually, I think, get a fixed penalty notice for the same offence, which you wouldn't have to declare, which is obviously a discrepancy there really. But as far as I'm concerned, if it's not a conviction, so if you didn't go to court, and it's not a caution, so for a caution you have to accept the offence, and you sign a caution certificate, they are exempt from being declared, so you don't have to declare them.
Okay. Good question, Richard. Good question indeed. Yeah. Andre wants to know, is it FTP Support who works with the College of Paramedic to provide their insurance, indemnity insurance?
No.
There we go. Nice and short, that, Andre, for you. Completely separate.
I can't elaborate on that anymore. So it's not, no.
Okay. Next question from Ian. Sorry, the question was for the NMC slide, but was answered on the slide for the HCPC. I think that was is work within the limits of knowledge and seen. Yeah. So we talked about that, didn't we? Hopefully that answered your question, Ian. But thanks for pointing that out to us. Question from Adam is, what do you do different from the MDU? I'm not too sure what the MDU is, Adam.
That's the Medical Defence Union. Without knowing exactly, the MDU would be a broader service, I think. So there are services that offer indemnity insurance, for example, against civil litigation claims, which we don't do. So our USP, if you like, is that we are more niche, and we have more experts in fitness to practice, whereas somebody like the MDU or other bodies might just hire a lawyer, like a high street solicitor. So it's not so much what we do differently, it's perhaps what I would suggest we do better, and that's because we focus in on one area. The other thing to note, and it's difficult for me to say this because I don't know the ins and outs of the NDU service, but I know that, as I mentioned before, I know that some bodies such as that won't cover you in every eventuality, whereas we do. So it's similar to an insurance policy in that you might find out a little bit too late that you're not covered for something when you think that you were, whereas we would cover any fitness to practice issue. And an example would be home insurance. If you left your front door open and you were burgled, you wouldn't be covered. Whereas with our cover, we would provide any help regardless of the allegation.
Interesting. Okay, last couple of questions. Question from Wendy is, what advice would you give to a pharmacist who is working with dangerously low levels of staff, and is there any situation where the pharmacist should close the pharmacy?
Another really good question. That really is. I'd have to know the ins and outs of the scenario, but the question of would you close the pharmacy? Absolutely yes, because if you are not happy with the processes in place, if you are not happy with the standards that you're providing, the level of care you're providing, absolutely yes, because this is something that healthcare professionals come up against, all the time, is competing with the standards that they're expected to adhere to with the practicalities of a working environment. And once you find yourself in a fitness to practice situation, to say that, well, you didn't want to say to your boss that you needed another member of staff doesn't look like a very good defence, really. So the principles, like I said, are fairly similar for all professions, and they will all include something along the lines of making patient care your #1 priority. So if that's what you've got to do, then that's what you've got to do, unfortunately.
Okay. Last question from Andre is, if FTP are providing lawyers to fitness to practice HCPC, would a member of FTP have to pay any extra costs?
Can you say that again, please? That was
If FTP are providing a lawyer to a fitness to practice HCPC hearing, would a member using your organisation have any extra costs to pay?
No, sorry, no, definitely no. So it's regardless of the allegation, which I've already mentioned, but also regardless of where that allegation goes, you do not pay any more on top of your membership. That is the point of your membership fee, is that you are not then charged for something. So it doesn't matter whether we close it at an early stage because it's a minor allegation, and it doesn't matter whether it's a very serious allegation that means that we need to get you the best support for your hearing. It doesn't matter. The important thing is to us is that as a member we represent you in the best way possible, and that is our #1 priority.
Okay, I'm signing up. You've sold it to me already. Last question from Colin before we wrap up for this evening is, apparently you have some kind of indemnity insurance if you are a member of a union, for example Unison. Would this be enough cover?
Well, we've touched on that really. The question of whether it's enough is I can't answer. And I don't think anyone can, because they don't know what's going to happen. You need to check, and a lot of people don't do this. You need to check the ins and outs of your indemnity insurance. And being a member of Unison or whoever, you need to be very clear on what it is that you are getting cover for, because this is what I said before: is that something can happen, and you check your cover, and you think, well, actually, it's not really worth what I thought it was. It's not going to help me out here. And like I said, a lot of those things have written into them that they won't cover X, Y, and Z. And I can't be specific about what that is because I don't know the ins and outs of the cover. But it wouldn't surprise me if it's things like things that happen in your private life, or things that they would claim were a willful act. So, for example, I'm sort of thinking about something off the top of my head: a pharmacist with some kind of controlled drug problem with the register or something, the running balance of the register. If they think that you've done that, you've made a mistake on that willfully, then they won't offer you that cover. So that would be my advice to people that have that type of cover. Check it out to make sure that it covers you for every eventuality. If it doesn't, then obviously our cover does, so that would therefore look slightly more attractive, I would suggest.
And I think on that note, Colin, you've pretty much summarised tonight, is if you have got insurance already, it's worthwhile going away tonight after this webinar and having a look at what it does cover, and certainly what it doesn't cover. But that leads me to say thank you very much, Oliver, for tonight's webinar. I've certainly found it very useful, and I will certainly jumping onto your website and having a look about signing up, because the subject fitness to practice scares me to death. So, guys and girls, we have got some more webinars. I did go through it earlier and let you have a look, but I'll quickly flick through them again. So we've got a webinar this Sunday from Mike Davis on structuring a teaching event. The next one we have on the 28th of March, talking about surgical airways. The next one we have on fabricator-induced illness, or what used to be known as Munchausen's by proxy, by Brendan Gray on the 21st of April. And again, on the 27th, we're going to talk about safeguarding children, the journey from referral to response. And then an introduction to paramedic ultrasound, which were presented by Paul Young on the 11th of May. And so for those people, you get your certificates, you'll literally have it dropped into your dashboard. So you just need to go into your CPD dashboard and have a look and edit what you've learnt from tonight's webinar presented by Oliver. If you want to have a look and book onto some more webinars, you can do that very simply by going to cpdme.com/webinar, or indeed just Google search CPD webinar, and they're completely free of charge to join at any time you want. And so that's all that leaves me to say is thanks very much. If you have any questions, you've got Oliver's details up earlier, or you can always drop the team an email and we'll happily forward Oliver's address. And again, his website and the presentation recording will be on the internet after tonight, so you can access it anytime you need to, or share it with friends and colleagues on social media. So again, thank you very much, Oliver, for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
You're very welcome indeed, and have a safe journey home, ladies and gentlemen. If you're still at work and you've spent some time there, take it easy, get yourself home, get your slippers on, get yourself a cup of tea, and have a good night. Thank you, and good night.